There is a man on a bank somewhere right now with both boots at the water's edge, throwing as far as he can, 40 yards, 50. Every cast a little longer than the last, like distance is a locked door, and he just hasn't found the right key yet. He isn't going to catch much for a while. And the reason has nothing to do with his cast. The reason is that he already walked over the fish. They were sitting in the shallow water he crossed to reach the spot he thought was the spot. A longer rod can buy you another 10 yards. It can't show you a fish sitting 6 feet from your boots. So here's the question that sticks with you once you really sit with it. Why would a fish choose water barely deep enough to cover its back when it has an entire lake to hide in? Answer that, and 12 places on your home water stop being scenery. Most of us look at a shoreline and see two things: bank and open water. Fish don't see it that way. Fish live along edges, where hard bottom turns soft, where light turns to shadow, where fast water brushes against slow water, where cover starts and where cover quits. So stop asking only how far can I cast. Start asking where does something change. That one question is going to walk us down this bank together, and we're starting before you even reach the water. Don't walk down yet. Stop about 10 feet short. Most bank anglers march straight to the edge, plant both boots, and then throw past the exact water they should have fished first. That closest fish is usually the first fish you lose, and you lose it before your lure ever touches water. Your shadow crossing the shallows, gravel crunching under your heel. A fish sitting in 2 feet of water is already nervous. It doesn't need much of an excuse. So your first cast doesn't need to be farther. It needs to be sooner. From back here, cast down the bank to your left and swim your bait through that skinny edge water, parallel, staying tight. Then the same thing to your right. Then a couple at 45 degrees. Only after that do you fish out toward the middle. 3 casts before you ever step to the edge. Remember those 3. We're going to finish them later. Now move 20 yards to your right and go slow. See how the shoreline pushes out just a little there? That's not a point on any map. That's maybe 3 feet of extra dirt. But 3 feet of dirt changes the depth beside it, bends the weed line, catches the wind, and turns whatever current there is. Sometimes geometry is structure, and nobody put it on a chart because it doesn't look like anything. Fan it. 1 cast to the near side, 1 right off the tip, 1 to the far side. 9 times out of 10, the side taking the wind or the current is the one that answers. Keep walking, and before you tie on anything clever, do this. Tie on a bare sinker and drag it slowly along the bank for 30 seconds. You're not fishing, you're reading. Sand feels like a smooth pull with nothing in it. Gravel gives you a fine, steady ticking through the rod, like dragging a stick along a fence. Rock is a knock and a stall, then a pop when it comes free. Mud is mushy, and the vibration just dies. The fish don't live in any one of those. They live where the feel changes. So when the ticking suddenly goes quiet, or the smooth pull turns into knocking, stop. You just found a line on the bottom that you could never have seen from up here. Your lure isn't only fishing, it's drawing you a map. Now look at the rock ahead of us. 100 yards of riprap, every chunk of it fishy looking, which is exactly the problem. Nothing stands out, and then it just stops. 1 last piece of stone, and then mud. Don't walk past that last rock. I've watched a lot of anglers walk the whole rock wall and never once fish the end of it. Put your bait tight against it and bring it along the seam where hard bottom disappears. Because now the fish doesn't have 100 yards of options. It has a corner. And there's your first real pattern. The sweet spot often isn't the cover. It's where the cover quits. Behind you is the boat ramp everybody used to launch this morning, and most people stand on it and cast away from it. That concrete doesn't end at the waterline. It keeps going, usually at an angle, until it drops off into whatever the bottom really is. That drop is a hard, clean edge in a lake full of soft, vague ones. Fish the left edge, fish the right edge, then find where the concrete quits. I'll say this plainly though, ramps are for launching boats. Fish the edges, keep your gear off the slab, and step aside the second a trailer backs down. Up ahead there's a pipe, and it's ugly, and everybody walks past it. A dry pipe is still structure. Rock around the mouth, a scour hole underneath, hard edges in a soft bank. But a pipe that's actually running becomes something else entirely. Now it's structure, plus moving water, plus a difference in temperature and clarity that the fish can feel from a good distance. When it's running, don't cast into the middle of the plume. Find the line where that push of water meets the still water beside it, and fish the quiet side of it. And stay out of anything fenced, posted, or private. Fish it from where you're allowed to stand. Which brings us to the thing that Pipe just taught you, and it's the one I'd want you to take home more than any single location. A fish doesn't want to fight current for breakfast. If it can tuck into soft water right beside the fast stuff and let the river carry food past its nose, that's the cheaper deal, every time. It's the difference between chasing the conveyor belt and standing next to it. You can see those lines if you look. A ribbon of foam. A row of leaves all traveling the same speed while the water beside them sits still. A ripple line that just refuses to break up. Cast along that line, not across it. Across it, your bait spends half a second in the zone. Along it, your bait spends the whole retrieve where the fish is already looking. Fish the boundary, not the force. Now that laydown, that tree has been in the water for years, and I'd bet almost everyone who walks this bank throws one cast into the middle of it and keeps going. That tree isn't one spot. It's at least 3. Where the trunk meets the bank, in water so shallow most people skip it. The tangle where the big branches fork, out in the middle, and the outer tip, where the last limbs reach into the deepest water the tree touches. Start with the shallow end, because that's the one everybody burns first. Then work out. If you only get 1 cast at a tree, take the outside tip. If you get 5, take it apart. Grass next. And here's where I want to push back on the usual advice. More grass is not automatically better, and not just for you. In really thick vegetation, a predator has cover everywhere and no clean lane to attack through. It can't see far, and it can't accelerate. So one small opening in a wall of weeds can matter more than 50 yards of perfect-looking grass, because that opening is where a fish can finally do its job. Hunt the imperfections. A hole, a point of grass sticking out, a boat lane, an inside cut where the bed pulls away from the bank, one isolated clump sitting all by itself. And here's the part that'll save you a wasted morning. Yesterday's best hole can be dead today if the water dropped a foot and left that grass sitting too shallow. Look at the rocks and the dock posts as you walk. That wet line tells you whether this lake is coming up or going down, and the fish already know which. Shade now, and everybody says shade is good, which is true and almost useless. What matters is the edge, the line where bright water becomes dark water. That's where a fish can sit hidden and look out into the light at things that can't see back. And that line moves. The bank that was loaded at 7 in the morning can be bare and glaring by 11, and alive again from the other side at 6. Same water, same shoreline, different hour. A fishing spot can move even when the shoreline doesn't. That's why you swore this stretch was dead. You may have just kept showing up at the wrong time of day. While we're on light, watch your own shadow. Early and late, when the fishing is best, your shadow is longest. Approach with the sun in your face when you can. 2 spots left, and this next one is standing right under you. On the outside of a river or creek bend, the current has been digging at that bank for years. It cuts underneath. From above you see grass and dirt and nothing worth casting at. Underneath, there's a ledge with deeper, cooler, darker water and a roof over it. Back off. Don't walk to the lip. Cast upstream, keep it parallel, and let the current swing your bait tight along that bank so it passes under the overhang instead of out in front of it. And don't stand on a crumbling edge. Undercut banks come apart. That's the whole point of them. Which leaves the last one, and it isn't an object at all. Everything we just walked past is a single clue. A hard bottom edge, a shade line, moving water, wood, a hole in the grass, and on most water those clues stack. Riprap where a culvert dumps in, a laydown lying across a current seam, a grass point at the mouth of a shady cut, a ramp edge that also happens to be a bottom transition. That stacking is the whole thing. 1 advantage gives a fish a reason to be there, 2 gives it a reason to stay, 3, and it doesn't have much reason to leave at all. So here's how I'd fish a bank with a clock running. 1 clue, give it 3 casts and keep walking. 2 clues, slow down and work it properly. 3 clues stacked in the same 20 feet, stay there 10 minutes and take it apart, even if the first few casts come back empty. Because the best bank spot usually isn't the biggest object out there, it's the smallest place where several advantages overlap. Distance doesn't find fish, intersections do. Now, one honest thing before you go, because I don't want you walking off with the wrong idea. Seeing all 12 doesn't mean fishing all 12. On any given day, most of them are quiet. Wind decides a lot of that. On a rough afternoon, the ugly, uncomfortable bank taking the chop is the first one I'd walk, and it's the last one most people pick, because casting there is miserable. Falling water pulls fish off the shallow stuff you fell in love with last week, and every spot within easy sight of the parking lot has already educated a lot of fish. So see the changes, then don't fish them all the same. And now those first 3 casts finally finish. Cast 1, parallel left. Cast 2, parallel right. Cast 3, 45 degrees left. Cast 4, 45 degrees right. Cast 5, straight at the closest real change you can see, whether that's the last rock, the grass hole, or the shadow line. 5 casts. 5 minutes. That's enough to tell you whether a stretch of bank deserves the next half hour of your life. If something answers, or if you feel that bottom change, stop counting and start dissecting. Picture that same angler again. Same shoreline. No new rod. No fish finder. Not 1 extra yard of casting distance. But now he stops short of the water. He sees the little bulge in the bank. He sees where the rock quits and the mud starts. He sees the lip of the ramp, the one hole in the grass, the line where bright water turns dark. The lake didn't change. He did. So your next fish may not be 10 yards farther out. It may be sitting in the water you've been stepping over for years. Check your state and local regulations before you go. Then go look at your bank again, slowly.